Welcome back to Curious Tech, and today we're doing the other half of the Homelab. Particularly, we're focusing on all the software that I have installed. Not every piece of software, not every tool. Some of the more intricate tools or specialized tools I'll cover down the line, but I'm mostly focusing on all the core tools that I use part of the Homelab main infrastructure. So we're going to start with the firewall. We're going to go into the NAS. We'll look into what service I'm using to run identity, policy, access, things like internal certificate authorities, Kerberos authentication, all that kind of cool stuff. Things you typically would not see in a Homelab whatsoever. This will be a good opportunity for if you guys have questions or want to see deep dives into any of these individual technologies. Let me know in the comments. For the firewall, I went with PFSense. There's a number of options out there, but PFSense is sort of the one that's been around the longest, has a huge community base around it, and installs on almost anything. One of the things you do want to be aware of when you're building a PFSense box is you want something with cryptographic libraries available. Without them, some of the more advanced things like VPN are going to be much slower without it, so you'll definitely want to make sure that that's enabled. Here with PFSense, you can handle things like VLANs, you can handle all of your access control lists, all of your firewall rules, additional networks that you want to set up. If you've got some specific project you want to do and you want to put that on a subnetwork, you can still have that managed out of PFSense. PFSense can handle your DNS and manage additional DNS forwarders if you need them. But PFSense also has a number of add-on packages you can use. Now you might want to be kind of careful with it, because as you load more and more software on your firewall, you run the risk of slowing down your firewall. And another thing to think about is if you're running all these services on your firewall and there's some sort of vulnerability issues with your firewall, every piece of software that you run on that firewall is a potential point of access that could be used or leveraged to more or less hack your firewall. And so you want to run the least amount of things there, because you should think of the firewall as a privileged device. So an example of a software that's kind of reasonable is something like HA Proxy. That will easily allow you to route services to where they're actually running. And that can be a really straightforward TCP connection back to whatever the real service is. And since all of that stuff's running through the firewall anyways, it's a pretty reasonable spot to put it. The other plugin that I have used on my PFSense is the Acme plugin. So that's the one that allows you to use LetsEncrypt. So if you want to be able to publicly connect to your PFSense, step one, you'll want to be able to have a DNS name for your public. Now, depending on what your DNS server is, PFSense should already support a dynamic DNS server. So you can go in the settings, support your dynamic DNS server where they'll talk to each other and ensure that the DNS name that you want for your subdomain always works regardless if you have a dynamic IP or not. After you have that, then you can also then set up LetsEncrypt, so you can have a certificate that's bound to that name. So you can use the certificate plugin, and you can use the Acme plugin, which would allow you to get a proper cert for your public-facing interface. Next thing we're looking at is FreeIPA. It's a pretty cool piece of software. So the IPA stands for Identity, Policy, and Authentication. So identity is users. Those are the individuals who have accounts. So in your typical fashion, you think of users coming from some place like Active Directory or LDAP. So in this case, we're talking about a Linux environment. So this is an LDAP user store. And so this gives you the main place where you manage those identities. Policy says, okay, what systems are being managed with those identities, and what policies are applied both specifically to the systems, to the identities, and to groups. So now you have sort of a centralized place where you can manage your policy. And then authentication says, okay, can you log on to these devices, or do they have certificates associated with it? So FreeIPA essentially takes a bunch of open source pieces of software and wraps them all up into a pretty well organized set of utilities that allow you to handle the IPA aspects of things. So there's things like CertMonger and a number of other utilities that are being managed. For example, IPA also managed DNS server. So when you build an IPA server, you have choices of which services you want to manage or don't want to manage. So I've decided to do an internal certificate authority also to manage the DNS records that are associated with those names, to manage the hosts, to manage users. And then when you start doing things like that, then you can do pretty cool things with policy where you can say, hey, this group of users can have access to this group of systems. You can instantly turn off users that you don't want to have access to certain users. You can craft policy things like, what pseudo rules do I want to have enabled? What are my default pseudo rules? Do I want to give some pseudo rules to a specific type of user? Do I not want certain users to access systems? Do I want to make a infrastructure account that I use for other services that I'm using? I mentioned Kerberos earlier. So part of, you can do some forms of single sign-on. You can connect to Radius servers. So all of these things that you typically would see in a commercial infrastructure, once you have IPA set up, you can then wrap all of that together. So that's what I'm using here. So as I mentioned, I have 2 Ubiquiti access points. In order to manage a Ubiquiti access point, you need a Unifi controller. So the Unifi controller has its newer user interface, and that allows you to get a really quick snapshot of your home network, particularly if you're using a full across-the-board Ubiquiti setup. Then you can get quite a bit of visibility and quite a bit of metrics. But even with the access points, you can get visibility into what kind of devices are connecting to your access points, how well your access points are handling traffic. And so it ends up being like a quick place where you can see how everything's going. You can manage updating your firmware for your access points through this, or in really any other Ubiquiti devices. And so the more of the Unifi infrastructure, and when I say more of the Ubiquiti devices, I specifically mean Unifi. For example, the Edge devices aren't supported as connecting here. But the more Ubiquiti unified devices you have in your network, all of those type of devices fold into the Unifi controller. We also have the Edge switch. Interestingly, for the Edge switches, there's 2 UIs right now, so that seems like they're sort of managing the old interface and the new interface. You'll notice that the U interface is starting to use a lot of the design styles that Ubiquiti's been using for a while. However, interestingly, a lot of the features that are in the old UI don't exist in the new one yet. That's probably why they're both still around. As you'll see, the new UI basically, you can see PoE information, VLAN information, and that's about it. Dashboards are nice, but there's just not a lot of information there, whether or not there's a link on the port or not, if you want to label the ports. One of the main parts for the Edge switch is that they really have a much more powerful command line utility. So a number of people I know that use the Edge switches rarely ever go to the UI. So to them, this migration between the old new UI and the new UI isn't as big of a deal to them, is because a lot of the power for them comes from through the access to the CLI. But overall, this interface allows you to come in and do all the core things that's important to it. But you do need to be aware of some of the features that you're trying to find, as some of them may not be in the new UI, at least as of today. At least as of version 191. Here we have FreeNas. I think the newest version is now called TrueNAS. So FreeNas is the network attached storage. This is the software that comes with it. Quite a powerful set of software, fully featured. You have to kind of know what's going on and be willing to read the manual a bit, but once you start to see what's happening, you'll see that it's quite powerful. You'll notice in my particular example, and one of the things I recommend when you set one of these up is to have essentially a fast and a slow side. So if you're setting up a FreeNas server and you don't have a really beefy machine, so you're talking more than 32 gigs of memory, pushing 64 gigs and above, then you want to be conscious of where you're going to get your speed from, and trying to manage, the different levels of cache and things of that nature are going to add complexity. And you really want to be pragmatic when it comes to complexity. So you really want to think about, is your complexity adding enough of value? I showed in the hardware video, I had the NVMe flash drive, and then I also have 3 disks that were shown in the front. So each of those create a separate pool. So you've got a trunk pool, which is sort of a larger array of storage, and then a fast pool. All of the stuff that I use in the fast pool is basically to light up the 1 gigabit port that's connected to this. So I can do, remote file editing, and you do it at full gigabit speeds. because the NVMe is fast enough, the NAS is fast enough, so you can get that stuff back and forth, and it works quite well. But then once I'm done with those files, I can go ahead and transition any of the things I want to keep off into the trunk. And so working is just sort of around. Some of the other things that FreeNas does is, it's not the ideal place for it, but you can run things like Docker container, you can run things like BSD jails. So if you don't have, or if you haven't spent some time to put an additional virtual machine environment together, starting with FreeNas is very nice. And this is actually what I did in my lab. Before I built other machines out, I used FreeNas as the primary machine to run my virtual machines. So actually today, I'm running my Unifi video software as a VM on FreeNas. I'm also running Plex server, which I'll go over in a little bit as well, as a jail, as a BSD jail. So it's running a couple pieces of additional software, sort of like a virtualization machine, because it supports it. Another thing to know that if you're going to be running a home lab, one thing to think about if you're building up all the storage is disaster recovery. FreeNas has a pretty good reputation about being very stable and not losing a lot of content, especially if you set it up well. However, you could have a disastrous event. Then what happens? If you have a fire or, a short, the whole thing fries. Like, what happens if a bad event happens? I highly recommend stuffing a lot of the content you care about into the cloud. So an example is they have some automated cloud backup services available that you can set up in FreeNas. So an example is you could say Amazon Glacier. You can stuff everything into Amazon Glacier. Amazon Glacier is pretty cheap per terabyte. In that particular case, they are pretty expensive to pull data out, but the scenario in which you're trying to pull stuff out of Glacier is a very disastrous event. You're basically thinking about Glacier or whatever other cloud storage you're using as a really big emergency. Some nice things is, it has cloud. Some nice things with FreeNas is it gives you some shells that you can get access to, whether it's a virtual machine, whether it's your jail, whether it's the actual FreeNas itself, and you can also get some other metrics. This is the interface for the Western Digital MyCloud Mirror. So this is the other NAS. This NAS I'm really just using to record all of my camera content to it. And since this is a embedded NAS device, it's much lower power than my FreeNas device. So since I'm doing camera recording, it's pretty easy to run this one off of the uninterruptible power supply that I mentioned before. So that way I consider this part of my core suite of equipment. But it's a pretty straightforward consumer grade NAS. So it just kind of tells you the status of the two drives that I have in there. Simple RAID that you can do across them. In my case, they're mirrors, MyCloud Mirror. You can look at setting up users for this. You can also browse your file hierarchy and things of that nature. I use it for a very simple NFS, network file share. Outside of that, I don't use this interface very much. I will say that I have been kind of surprised with the firmware updates I've seen on this. For consumer grade devices, generally get very, very few firmware upgrades. This device has been discontinued for many years, and I think fairly recently a firmware update came out for it. So I was quite surprised. I don't know if that shares some things in common with some of the other MyCloud mirrors that they make, but I was just surprised that they were actually still updating the firmware for it. So in addition to the Unifi networking gear, I went with the Unifi video series. I wouldn't say that I picked it for any compelling good reason. I picked it because I didn't do enough research. When I looked at the Unifi controller, it talked about managing all things Unifi. And when you look at the product line for Ubiquiti, they have Unifi stuff, they have Amplify stuff, they have Edge stuff, they have some other long range networking things. And so when they talk about the Unifi controller, it came across as that the Unifi interface and controller can manage anything branded with the Unifi name. So when you say Unifi cameras, I thought, oh, the Unifi networking gear and the Unifi cameras, they'd all be managed by the same centralized system. This is not the case. The Unifi cameras are ran by their own separate set of software. And not only are they run by their own separate set of software, in my case, I was looking to run the Unifi controller on the Raspberry Pi. So in the hardware video, you noticed I have a Pi 4 running. One of the things that it's running is the Unifi controller. So if you're familiar with the Raspberry Pi, or if you're not familiar with the Raspberry Pi is not a typical computer. So if you think most computers, a vast majority of computers that people think of are run on what's called an x86 architecture, traditional Intel AMD architecture. The Raspberry Pi is run on an ARM architecture. And so why that matters is when you write software for a different computer architecture, you have to compile it for that architecture, and that operating system has to have the dependent libraries required to run it. So in the case of Unifi controller, the Unifi controller is built for ARM in addition to Intel, in addition to Windows, in addition to Mac. Unifi video, however, is built for much less operating systems. So in that case, I can't run Unifi video on the Raspberry Pi 4, which is how I turned around and ended up having to make a Unifi video VM to run on the FreeNas. Again, going back to it, FreeNas having the ability to run virtual machines and handle additional workloads becomes useful in that case if you start with something like that, because you'll probably need a NAS anyway. Having a place to run VMs and other services until you have a place to offload them is nice. Getting back to the Unifi video, got a couple of cameras. In my case, I got 4, 3 of their normal G3 series, and then the G3 Pro. And so the Unifi software, they have a lot of really nice user interface, so it looks kind of sharp, has a number of features, allows you to outline sections of the video. If you want to do something like record on motion, set sensitivity levels, which really just deal with the number of pixels that change within the frame. If enough pixels change within a frame, then it clicks on and starts recording. You can see different things like, how is the performance of a camera doing? Does it have high memory load, high CPU load? You can see this new interesting timeline view where you can do an accelerated playback over the course of, days, weeks, months. So you can sort of create your own time lapse in order based on the recordings you have. One thing I will say is, regardless of if you're using the Unifi cameras, if you want a centralized camera service, you can also use something called ZoneMinder. And so ZoneMinder does a number of the things similar to Unifi. I forgot to mention Unifi camera has a mobile app, so that's how I use it most of the time, is I pull it up and I'm looking at the cameras from my cell phone. That's how I access the camera almost all the time. ZoneMinder is something similar to Unifi. I haven't run it yet, but it seems interesting, particularly with some of their plugins like AI detection for people versus animals or some other thing like that. And they supposedly have a mobile app as well. And they also support many, many different cameras, not just the Unifi version. Lastly, with Unifi is they moved over to a set of software called Unifi Protect. And Unifi Protect cannot be installed on your own hardware. You have to buy one of their network video recorders in order to use Unifi Protect. So it's not clear to me how much longer I'm going to be able to run the Unifi video controller. And since I currently don't have a Dream machine that has an NVR or a dedicated NVR, I may be forced to switch over to ZoneMinder anyway. As I mentioned, I'm running Plex on the FreeNas under the BSD jail. It's kind of like a plugin. Not an approach I'd recommend. Install it separately. The downside about running some of the plugins that come with FreeBSD is you only can update the software when they put out a new version of the plugin. And it doesn't seem like they're updating plugins as frequently, definitely not that frequently. So you want to go a different route, whether that's in a virtual machine, Docker, or something of that nature. So I have a Plex running, not the ideal scenario, but it does work. Great for serving up your content. So if you've got videos, if you've got music, all sorts of content like that, it ends up having really nice apps, lots of photos, things of that nature. It ends up having really nice apps that you could share things with. Again, I mentioned in my Ubiquity hack video that I'm not a big fan of cloud-enabled services. However, unlike your network gear, since it's not running your critical infrastructure, it's not unreasonable to have this service running remotely. So lots of people really like Plex for that purpose of being able to connect into their home network and get access to a lot of the media that they have available. Things you might want to consider for that is, what is your, not just your downlink speed, but what is your uplink speed for your home network? In other words, like how fast can you push traffic out of your network, not just pull it in. So traditionally, a lot of the cable internet providers have good downlink speeds, but very, very slow uplink speeds. So if you're in one of those cable providers and you want to serve your own content, you could be getting, 5% of your downlink speeds. Compare that with some of those providers that have fiber optics based backhauls. Those providers a lot of times offer near parity. So if you're getting 100 megabits internet home connection, you might get 100 megabits down, 100 megabits up, 300 down, 300 up, gigabit down, gigabit up. But for some of the cable providers, they might say, oh, you get 300 down, but you might only get 5 megabits up. Reason you want to think about that is high definition video typically ranges between 5 and 15 megabits, and that's just HD, not 4K or anything like that. So you could easily see that even if you were running at an optimal scenario, if your cable provider only supports 5 megabits, you won't be doing much streaming from your house. Same thing if you're VPN into your home network and you want to pull out different websites. 5 megabits not bad. So in that case, you might be more concerned on what the latency looks like. But just know that your outbound traffic matters for these types of services. And yes, I know that was a whirlwind, but I just wanted to cover the core pieces of software that are running in the Homelab, really dependent services. And as we start to dig into other technologies, things that might be related to Docker, things that might be related to other infrastructure or software services, just having that dependent infrastructure. For example, I can't echo enough how nice it is to have a certificate authority running inside of your network, because when you're building out certain tools, being able to set them up as close to you as to production is very valuable. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to set up a service in demo mode, tried to then go set it up in something that looks like production, and found that the differences were wide enough that had I known I was going to run into these issues or the configuration was so annoying, it may not be a service I'd be willing to use. Generally, the experience of being able to lean in when you're testing, when you're building things, to do it as close to the way you would do it as a production service adds the biggest bang for its buck from a learning perspective. And then also, there's just sort of this hybrid aspect here, right? This Homelab is my home network. So some of it is about ease of use for my life, for my family. Other parts of it are about being able to do things in a more secure manner. And the last part is really about things that a playground that you can test things that wouldn't easily be testable without a certain amount of infrastructure. So you could think of this as the base. And as you see other videos coming in the near future where other devices will be coming online, other services will be coming online, you'll see that I'll refer back to some of these pieces of technology, or I'll be leaning on them to be able to do these other things quickly. If this was interesting and you want to see what else I have in store, please subscribe to the channel. If you want to see any more detail on any of these specific technologies that I really blasted through, let me know in the comments. What do you want to know more about? I might make a dedicated video about it and really deep dive into it. Until next time, Curious Tech out.